World War II. This phrase conjures images of devastation, millions of lost lives, and unspeakable suffering. Over 70 million people, military and civilian, perished in this bloodiest conflict in human history. And if you think only Adolf Hitler is responsible for these atrocities, you'd be mistaken. Japanese forces and their commanders also bear a significant portion of the blame for these casualties, perpetrating horrific atrocities from Pearl Harbor to Chinese cities. But the most astonishing part begins after the war ended. The fates of these leaders after Japan's surrender varied dramatically. From a horrific death by hanging to leading the nation decades later. Why did this happen? Why were some brought to trial and executed while others miraculously escaped punishment and even returned to the pinnacle of power despite a bloody past? And can this truly be called justice? Before World War II, Japan was no longer just an isolated island nation. After World War I, it had emerged as an aggressive empire, dreaming of complete domination in Asia. By the 1930s, its expansionist ambitions escalated into outright military aggression. After invading Manchuria in 1931, militarist forces quickly seized control of the government. Decisions were no longer made by civilian politicians. Generals and army officers completely directed foreign policy. Japan was transforming into a war machine where democratic voices were silenced and military command became absolute. Official propaganda claimed Japan's goal was to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, but the truth was a cover for building its own empire under the myth of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In reality, this meant occupation, forced labor, and brutal violence. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war against China. The world then saw the empire's true face. Japanese forces committed widespread atrocities, burning villages and torturing civilians. The most infamous example was the Nanjing Massacre, where nearly 200,000 civilians were slaughtered. This was not chaos, it was planned terror. Simultaneously, Japan prepared for conflict with the West, embracing a dangerous ideology of racial superiority and the emperor's divine status. Children were taught that dying for the emperor was an honor, and that Americans and British were subhuman enemies deserving destruction. By the late 1930s, Japan was ready. A powerful military, a fanatical populace, and a clear strategy. All that remained was the right moment. On December 7, 1941, Japan made its most decisive move. Without any declaration of war, its aircraft launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Thousands dead, ships sunk, planes destroyed. This attack instantly pulled the United States into the conflict. In the first months, Japan achieved stunning victories, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, and Burma. It seemed nothing could stop its advance, but in 1942, the tide turned at Midway. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers became a pivotal moment. American industry transformed into a relentless war machine, while Japan began to choke from a lack of resources. Year by year, the front lines shrank, and Japanese garrisons on islands were wiped out. Yet surrender was not in the Japanese psyche. Death for the emperor was considered the only honor. Suicide charges and kamikaze pilots became their brutal reality. By 1945, the war had reached Japan's doorstep. The United States was preparing to invade the home islands, but it wasn't necessary. After firebombing, America unleashed its deadliest weapon. August 6th. Hiroshima, August 9th. Nagasaki. 2 cities were erased in seconds, hundreds of thousands dead. Japan was brought to its knees. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, crushing Japanese resistance within days. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke to his people. For the first time in history, the Japanese heard the voice of their living God announcing surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war was over. But the reckoning was just beginning. Now, the world would ask, who was responsible? And what happened to those who led Japan into the abyss? Emperor Hirohito, who ascended the throne in 1926, was not merely the head of state but a true symbol of divine Japan, a living deity. His Showa era became a period of profound transformations, from aggressive militarism to post-war reconstruction. During World War II, Hirohito formally led the empire. Although he did not directly command the army, he was deeply aware of all military operations, received reports, and participated in strategic decisions. He also knew about the atrocities committed by the Japanese army in China and other occupied territories, although he did not directly order the barbarities. This awareness would later become a key stumbling block in debates about his responsibility. As the war approached its catastrophic end, it was Hirohito who played a decisive role in the decision to surrender. Following the atomic bombings and the USSR's entry into the war, the emperor, against the wishes of some military officials who wanted to fight to the last, made the unprecedented decision to capitulate. On August 15, 1945, he addressed the nation via radio, announcing the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration's terms, which shocked the nation. After the surrender, Hirohito's fate was unpredictable. Unlike other Axis leaders, Emperor Hirohito was not brought to trial for war crimes. This was a conscious decision by the United States, particularly General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. The U.S. opted to preserve the monarchy for the stability of post-war Japan, fearing widespread unrest and communist sentiment if he were removed. Hirohito was seen as an indispensable symbol of unity who could aid in the country's peaceful transformation. However, the price for this preservation was high. On January 1, 1946, Hirohito made a historic declaration in which he publicly renounced his divine status, declaring himself an ordinary human being. This act was fundamental to the demilitarization and secularization of Japanese society. He continued to serve as a symbolic figure, remaining on the throne until his death in 1989. His activities were primarily ceremonial, focused on meeting foreign leaders and maintaining national unity. Despite Hirohito avoiding legal accountability, his moral role in the war remains a subject of intense debate. Many historians still consider him morally guilty for his passive role in war crimes and for not stopping the aggression earlier or using his authority to prevent atrocities. His figure remains one of the most complex in Japanese history, symbolizing both the dark chapters of the imperial past and the country's path to peace. If Emperor Hirohito was the symbol of divinity, then Hideki Tojo was its earthly, ruthless embodiment. This man, known as the Razor, for his uncompromising nature and sharp intellect, became one of the most influential and ominous figures in Japan's military and political leadership. From 1941 to 1944, Tojo held the positions of Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Army, effectively concentrating immense power in his hands. He was the chief ideologue of the war with the U.S. and other Western powers, convinced of the necessity of expanding Japanese dominance in Asia. It was Tojo who ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which catalyzed the United States' entry into World War II and opened a new, devastating front of the conflict. Under his leadership, Japan launched a rapid expansion throughout Southeast Asia, marked by both brilliant victories and horrific war crimes. Tojo was fanatically devoted to the idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and advocated for continuing the war to the very end, even when defeat became evident. When Japan finally surrendered, Tojo fully understood that an inevitable trial and severe punishment awaited him for his role in the war. On September 11, 1945, as American military police arrived at his residence in Setagaya, Tokyo, to arrest him, Hideki Tojo attempted to shoot himself. He fired a pistol into his chest, but surprisingly, the bullet passed through his body without hitting vital organs. The suicide attempt proved unsuccessful, and he survived. American medics who arrived at the scene provided him with immediate care, effectively saving his life. He was treated, and after his recovery, he was arrested. Next, Tojo faced the Tokyo Tribunal, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where he, like many other Japanese leaders, was charged with war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. Throughout the lengthy trial, which lasted from 1946 to 1948, Tojo remained stubborn and unrepentant. He took full responsibility for his actions, but until the very end he justified his actions, claiming that all his decisions were made for the emperor and for the benefit of Japan. He viewed the war as an act of defense aimed at protecting Japan from Western imperialism. After a thorough review of the evidence, in November 1948, Tojo was found guilty on most counts. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and the sentence was carried out on December 23, 1948. Tojo's death marked a symbolic end to the era of militaristic Japan and retribution for its aggressive policies. From the ruthless politician who guided the war, let's turn to an outstanding strategist whose battlefield glory was overshadowed by a terrible tragedy. General Tomoyuki Yamashita entered history as one of the most talented Japanese military commanders, earning the nickname Tiger of Malaya. This title was bestowed upon him for his extraordinary achievements in the early stages of World War II. In February 1942, Yamashita accomplished something incredible. He swiftly captured Singapore, which was considered an impregnable fortress of the British Empire. His forces, despite being outnumbered by the British, launched a daring assault through jungles and swamps, forcing the massive garrison to surrender in just 70 days. This victory became one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the British Empire and significantly boosted Japan's prestige. Yamashita's military abilities were undeniable, and he was rightly regarded as a brilliant tactician. However, unfortunately, his name is also associated with one of the war's most horrific tragedies. Later, Yamashita was appointed commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines. It was under his overall command that Yamashita's army was responsible for the Manila Massacre, which occurred in February-March 1945 during the retreat of Japanese troops. In an attempt to slow the advance of American forces, and also due to despair and lack of control, Japanese soldiers committed unthinkable atrocities against the civilian population. Thousands of innocent civilians in Manila were brutally murdered, tortured, raped, and subjected to other horrific crimes. Despite the fact that Yamashita personally did not order these mass killings and even, according to some accounts, tried to stop them, the chaos and desperation within his troops led to unspeakable suffering. After Japan's surrender, Tomoyuki Yamashita was arrested and brought before a military tribunal in Manila. It was here that a new concept of international law was applied and developed, the so-called command responsibility, which was later called the Yamashita Doctrine. This doctrine asserts that a commander can be held accountable for crimes committed by his subordinates, even if he did not give direct orders for these crimes or was unaware of them, if he failed to take all possible measures to prevent them or punish the perpetrators. The court found Yamashita guilty precisely on the basis of this concept. He was held responsible for the crimes committed by his soldiers because he was unable or unwilling to effectively control their actions. Despite the fact that he did not order the mass killings, and his defense argued that he had lost control over some units amidst the chaotic retreat, the court handed down a harsh sentence. Tomoyuki Yamashita was executed in 1946 by hanging. Among Japanese leaders whose fates were decided after the war, Nobusuke Kishi stands out with his paradoxical journey from war criminal to prime minister. Even before the full-scale war began in the 1930s, Kishi gained significant influence, earning the nickname Shadow Leader of Manchuria. He played a key role in the economic management of the puppet state of Manchukuo, controlling the development of heavy industry and resources, which was largely based on the exploitation of the local population and forced labor. With the outbreak of World War II, Kishi entered Hideki Tojo's wartime cabinet, serving as Minister of Commerce and Industry, and later as Vice Minister of Munitions. In these high positions, he was directly involved in the exploitation of China and other occupied territories, securing the supply of raw materials and labor for the Japanese war machine. His name was closely associated with economic aggression and the brutality of the occupation regime. After Japan's surrender, Nobusuke Kishi, as one of the key figures of the wartime government, was arrested as a Class A war criminal. the highest category of suspects. He spent 3 years, 1945 to 1948, in Sugamo prison, where other high-ranking Japanese officers and officials were held, awaiting a trial that could likely have resulted in a death sentence or life imprisonment. However, to the surprise of many, in December 1948, Kishi was released without trial. The reasons for his release are still a subject of intense historical debate. It is believed that the American occupation authorities, already facing the onset of the Cold War and the growing communist influence in Asia, particularly the communist victory in China, saw Kishi as a potential ally. His strong anti-communist views and experience in industrial management could be valuable for rebuilding Japan as a stable and pro-American bastion in the region. Thus, a man who just yesterday was considered a war criminal was pardoned for the sake of new geopolitical objectives. Even more astonishing, Kishi not only returned to civilian life, but also brilliantly revived his political career. In 1957, he subsequently became Prime Minister of Japan from 1957 to 1960. This was a remarkable political comeback that shocked many both in Japan and abroad. As Prime Minister, Kishi played a significant role in rebuilding the Japanese economy, strengthening the alliance with the U.S., and revising the 1960 Security Treaty, which sparked massive protests due to his authoritarian methods and ties to the past. His story is one of the most scandalous examples of how a criminal could become a leading reformer of the state, highlighting the complexity of moral choices and political compromises in the post-war world. From a political figure who went from prisoner to prime minister, we will now delve into the shadowy world where crime, intelligence, and high politics intersected. The story of Yoshio Kodama is a fascinating yet disturbing account of how an individual from the criminal underworld could become one of the most influential figures in post-war Japan. Kodama was neither a general nor a minister in the traditional sense, but his influence was immense, penetrating into the deepest corners of Japanese society. He was a notorious gangster who led his own network of criminal organizations and at the same time an influential agent of Japanese military intelligence. Before and during World War II, Kodama actively worked for the Japanese army in China. His activities were far from noble. He was involved in racketeering, controlled smuggling, and was deeply involved in the large-scale opium trade. This drug was used by the Japanese army not only to finance its operations, but also to undermine Chinese society, rendering it dependent and weakened. Alongside this, Kodama gathered intelligence, leveraging his criminal connections and influence. Through these shadowy operations, he amassed vast wealth, which became his key asset in the future. He was a master manipulator who knew how to turn dirty money into political power. After Japan's surrender, Kodama, like many others associated with the military regime, was imprisoned by American occupation forces. He was suspected of war crimes and ties to ultranationalist secret societies. It seemed his career was over. However, similar to Nobusuke Kishi, Kodama's story took an unexpected turn. He was released from prison relatively quickly, likely due to a deal with American authorities. With the onset of the Cold War and the rise of communist sentiment in the region, the Americans actively sought anti-communist forces in Japan. Kodama, with his connections in the criminal underworld and ultra-right views, proved to be a valuable asset. In post-war Japan, Yoshio Kodama became one of the most influential figures behind the scenes, a true criminal gray eminence. He continued to control significant financial flows, originating from both his old sources and new, often illicit schemes. These funds he used to sponsor right-wing politicians, finance their election campaigns, and ensure their loyalty. Through this, Kodama wielded incredible influence over the shaping of the Japanese political landscape, working from the shadows. Furthermore, he maintained close ties with the CIA, acting as an intermediary and using his network to support American interests in the fight against communist influence in Japan. His life is a vivid example of how criminal elements can weave into higher politics, leaving a deep and often unnoticed mark on history. The name of Masaharu Homma, General of the Imperial Japanese Army and Governor of the Philippines, is forever etched into the tragic pages of World War II. It was Homa, as commander-in-chief, who was responsible for the Bataan Death March in April 1942. After the surrender of approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war, they were forced to undertake an exhausting 100-kilometer march under inhumane conditions. Thousands of dead Americans and Filipinos perished from abuse, starvation, thirst, and disease. This was one of the most horrific acts of the war, and Homa bore full responsibility for it, even if he did not issue direct orders for the atrocities. After the war, Homa faced a military tribunal in Manila. His trial was one of the first and most significant trials of Japanese war criminals. Homa's defense attempted to argue he was unaware of all the atrocities during the death march, but the prosecution insisted on his command responsibility. During the trial, Homa even stated, "I am responsible for the actions of my subordinates," which became a landmark acknowledgement of the principle under which he was ultimately convicted. The court found Masaharu Homa guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was hanged in 1946 in the Philippines. Homa's fate served as a stark warning to all military commanders, solidifying the concept of command responsibility in international law from military leaders who were held accountable for the crimes of their subordinates. We now turn to arguably the most chilling and repugnant figure on our list, a man whose actions transcended any understanding of human cruelty. Shiro Ishii, a name that evokes terror and disgust, for it is associated with some of the most horrific crimes against humanity in history. This Japanese microbiologist was the head of Unit 731, a clandestine unit of the Imperial Japanese Army based in Pingfang, Manchuria. Unit 731, disguised as a unit for epidemic prevention and water purification, was in reality a center for biological warfare and inhumane medical experiments on live human beings. Ishii and his team oversaw the most horrific human experiments in Manchuria. Their test subjects were thousands of Chinese, Korean, Soviet, and Mongolian prisoners of war and civilians whom they referred to as logs, maruta. These individuals endured unimaginable torture in the name of science. Ishii infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, and other deadly diseases to study the effects of these pathogens on the human body and to develop biological weapons. He also conducted gruesome experiments such as live vivisections without anesthesia, limb amputations, freezing and thawing of limbs to study frostbite, investigating the effects of gas gangrene, and infecting prisoners with venereal diseases. The goal was to create the perfect weapon that could destroy the enemy without the use of expensive ammunition. The total number of victims of Unit 731 is estimated to be in the tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of people. After Japan's surrender, the fate of Shiro Ishii and his subordinates should have been similar to that of Tojo or Homa. However, what happened still causes outrage. Ishii and most members of Unit 731 were not prosecuted for their horrific crimes. The reason lay in a deal with the United States. The U.S., recognizing the immense value of the data collected by Ishii on biological weapons, decided to exchange his immunity for the research data. This meant that all the collected information, which included the results of thousands of human experiments, was handed over to the American military in exchange for Ishii and his team's complete exemption from criminal prosecution. The Americans sought an advantage in the arms race and the development of biological weapons, and this decision was made with national security in mind. Following this agreement, Shiro Ishii returned to Japan. Instead of vanishing into the shadows as often assumed, he, according to some reports, worked as a biologist and pharmacist, and even opened his own pharmaceutical company or clinic where he performed free examinations and treatments. This is the most shocking aspect of his fate. A man responsible for unthinkable atrocities was able to return to a peaceful profession and possibly even continue medical practice, albeit in a different form. He died in 1959 of throat cancer, having never faced punishment for his inhumane actions. This case remains one of the most disgraceful and controversial chapters in the history of post-war justice, symbolizing how geopolitical interests can override moral principles and the demands of justice, allowing criminals to evade accountability.